One thing I almost forgot to do was tighten this bolt that goes on the oil pump. So what I've done is I've just flipped the engine on its side, and without the oil pan on, you can get a wrench in here. And so I just held on to everything and I tightened this. It's only about 18 foot-pounds, but just don't forget. The next pieces we're going to put in are going to be the clutch plates and friction plates, all right here. So we're going to get these put in place. And you can see they line up with the notches here, like so. So the friction plate notches match this, and the clutch plate notches will match this inside part. And that's it. You just put them on one after the other like so. I'll get the rest on off camera. So we've got all the clutch and friction plates in place. The next piece we need to put in is the throwout plate. So here's a bearing that sits down in here. This is the throwout pin, I guess is what I would call it. It sits inside there. And then this whole section will go on. Now we have the clutch springs and the bolts that hold them on. So we're going to put these on next. They just kind of go in like so, and you just want to run the first couple of threads in. I'll get the rest put in place like this and we'll tighten them up. I got the rest of these in. We're going to go ahead and tighten these down using the torque wrench here. These are 10 millimeter and they get tightened to 106 inch-pounds. I'm going to do this off camera. I'll be right back. So I believe that we've got the right hand side of the engine completely reassembled. I'm going to turn it around. We'll get the flywheel on. There are two parts to putting this flywheel back on. There is the starter gear. If you recall from the disassembly video, it just slides on here. Now we will get the flywheel, and we'll have to get this pressed on here. I'm going to use my torque wrench to do that. So the primary thing to remember when you're putting this flywheel on, make sure you put the starter gear behind it. And if you look behind here, this is the part that keeps the starter gear from moving, and it lets it only move one direction. So that will slide on. The other thing is there's a keyway here, if you see right here, and there's a woodruff key. Fine, we'll go upside down so you can see it there. That woodruff key has to line up in this slot. So you just, lightly put it on here and turn it until it slides into that slot with that woodruff key. And you want to make sure that you've got that correct, because if you don't, the timing will be off. We've got this on. I'm going to put some thread lock on here too. So I've tightened this bolt. This is a 14 millimeter, and it gets tightened to 76 foot-pounds. We're done here. The next thing we're going to do is put the starter gear in place. So this is the starter gear, and this gear is going to mesh up against this one, and it's just kind of held in place by this pin. So we can just drop it in here, get those gears meshed together, and then we'll slide this pin in place, and we'll go ahead and get the cover put on. Before I do this, I've got to make a gasket for this because I do not have one. So as with every surface that requires a gasket, well, nearly every surface, it's been cleaned, dried. Here's our gasket. We're going to put just a little bit of this ultra black gasket sealer on each side of this gasket. Real thin layer. I'm going to do that, set the gasket on, and then we'll get it on the engine. I've got the gasket sealer and the gasket on here. I'm going to just put one of these bolts through one of the holes. So we're going to line up this hole with this pin, and this bolt will go here, and we'll get this on. Remember, this is magnetized, so it's going to try to pull like that. Just gotta maneuver it around. Okay, I'm gonna pull this back off real quick, and I'm going to go ahead and put the gasket on this side first. Seem to be having a little bit of trouble locating that pin. So I'm just going to set it on there like so. Okay, so we've got it lined up. I'm going to just put these in here. These are 8mm bolts. I'll get the torque settings and I'll be back. I've got all these on now, and I am just going to tighten them to about 80 inch-pounds. So I keep knocking you around. I'm just going to finish this off camera. While I was working on something else, many of you may have noticed when I put this clutch pack together, this last one here, I had rotated into these slots. So off camera, I've taken these bolts and springs out, pulled this, and put that in the way it's supposed to be. So they should all be in that slot right there. They shouldn't be in these other slots. Now for one of the all-important parts, and the main reason we took this apart in the first place, the head. Now, if you watched the rest of the videos, you saw that we tested the head and this top half of the block for cracks. We found none. This is the gasket that was on there when I took it apart. And you can see it's literally one thin layer of metal. It's like a piece of tin foil. So on this number 1 cylinder up here, you can see there was a lot of junk right here in between the surfaces. So these surfaces were not cleaned to begin with when this was apparently put in. So this, that's going in the trash. Now I got a real head gasket. So this is a Cometic, and it's at least 2 layers thick. I know you can't really see it there, but this is a much more well-made gasket. I'm going to unpack this. We're going to get it set on here, and we'll get the head and the head bolts put in and torqued down. Get you set up and we'll do that. Just to show you the difference in quality between that gasket and this one is actually 3 layers thick. I've got this gasket set on. It can only go on one way. There's 2 pins up here. This one is stuck in the head, and this one I have put in here to locate this gasket. So we're going to just go ahead and get this head set on there. And you can see there's the other pin. First thing we want to do is make sure we get this chain pulled through. I have a different idea for that. I have looped this piece of wire through the chain. I should be able to just pull this wire through, up, through, head pin located where it should be, chain pulled through, guides are in place, and we've got it located on the pins, which is what we need. Now we can get the bolts in place and get them torqued down. I've finger tightened all of these bolts in here. I'll get you up here so you can see the bolts that are down, and we're going to tighten them in kind of a clockwise circular pattern. And we're going to do it in 3 steps. These will get tightened down to 35 foot-pounds. I'm first going to tighten them to 15, then to 25, then to 35. I'm going to do the first 2 steps, and I'll come back and we'll tighten them to 35 final. Now we're doing the final 35 foot-pounds in the same pattern that we did the rest. We've got the head on and torqued down. Now we're gonna go ahead and get the cam, the chain, and the tensioners all put back in and get the cam cover on. We're gonna complete this section before we put the cams in. We've got to put the cups that go over these valves that the lobes on the cam push on. And if you remember, we had marked them all. So this is E4, this is the exhaust side, and we started on number 1 cylinder side. So we went 1, 2, 3, 4. So the contents of this bag will go on this valve. Let me show you what those contents are. Each one of these cups, if you look inside, it may be stuck in there or it may have come out. There's a spacer, and I can get that in the camera here. There's a spacer here, and it has a number on it. Each one of these has been measured at the factory to fit with this cup. So we need to put this spacer on, and I just generally put it number up right inside there. So you can see there's no spacer here, but I've put the spacer here, and then this cup just very gently slides right in there. So we're gonna do the rest of these in the order that we took them out. We've got all of the push cups and spacers back in their proper locations. Now we've got to get the cams fit into here, positioned correctly, and then we'll get this other side on. We'll get the top back on here, and we'll get the timing set. The most important part, the timing. We're about to unwrap these cams and get them put in place here. Before we do that, put some assembly lube along all of this. I have unwrapped this cam. There is a mark on here, and it's upside down, but this one says N. So this is the intake cam. You can see it says N. On the gear, there's a mark that says N. So these gears are made to go on either or. So there, it also has an EX, but this is the intake cam. And on the N right here, see that line? That line that I just showed you lines up with this flat part of the head. So I'm going to get that intake in there, and then we'll do the same thing with the exhaust. The exhaust cam is the exact same way. It has a mark that says EX that will line up here. One of the first things that we need to have set up is this timing mark. If you can see that mark that says T, so this doesn't say TI, it's a T with a line next to it, kind of right here. You can see there's an indentation right there. So at top dead center, you want that T mark to line up directly with that mark on the casing. That way you know that the crankshaft and the pistons are in the correct location for you to put the cams in. So I'm going to try to show you how to get this thing lined up. Again, that we have the N mark. So we're just going to pull the chain up. We're going to kind of line that mark up as best we can. So we'll set it in place, and you can see here it's way too low. So we're going to move a tooth. We're going to pull this up, and we'll move this up a tooth. And it's pretty close. And I may move it another tooth just to see. I'm going to call this good for now. You can see it's not perfect. We need to look at it from this angle so we can see it's lining up pretty well. So I'm going to call that one good, and we're going to unwrap the exhaust cam and see if we can get that one also in here. We've got the exhaust cam, and as you can see, it has a mark that says EX. So we want that EX to line up right here. This is where it gets a little tricky. We're going to pull this up. I'm going to try to wiggle this in here. There we go. It's in the chain. The N is here. The EX is here, and it should be down here. So we're just going to kind of wiggle it around until we get the EX down here. The N is fairly close, so the intake side. And the exhaust side, it's kind of close. And I'm not quite sure what's going to happen when I tighten these down, they're going to push down quite a bit. I'm not quite sure what effect that's going to have on how these are lining up here. I think the next thing we're going to do is go ahead and tighten down the camshaft holder, and we'll check the timing right after that. This is the camshaft holder. There are bolt holes, and on this side there are O-rings here that seal onto the top of this. So we need to make sure all of these are lined up. There's two towers right here, and they're going to hold the camshaft guide that goes on top of here. So we want to make sure that we put these two towers on this side. We're just going to set this in place. And that looks fairly good. I think we might actually have these lined up correctly. So I'm going to grab the bolts for this, and we'll get the bolts in place, and we'll tighten them the same way we did the head. So this is a piece of aluminum. It's very brittle. Let me bring you over here. The cams sit inside of here, and some of these, if you can see, are pushing down on the valves. And those valves have tension pushing back. So there's some over here. These are facing out, so there's no pressure on them. These are facing in, so there's no pressure on them. But these two in the middle are pushing against the springs. So what would happen is if we tightened the ends, if I tightened this end and this end without tightening these two, it would crack this in the middle because the pressure would be too great here. So what we really want to do is start, and you can tell where you need to go from here because these are numbered. And we're going to tighten these in 3 stages just like we did the rest of them. So there's 1, and then 2, and then I believe 3's over here, 4. But you can look at this and see the numbers, and this is the order that you need to tighten these. But don't tighten them all at once. Don't tighten it all the way down. So I guess what I mean is don't tighten bolt 1 all the way to a specified torque. So if the torque on here, and I'll figure out what that is, we want to do it in thirds. So we want to go 3 rounds of tightening these to keep this from cracking. Okay, so if you watch the videos where we took this apart, you'll remember that the bolts that are inside these spark plug housings right here, there are 8 of them. They all had these brass washers. Make sure that these with the copper washer go into these holes, and you can finger tighten these, no problem with that. Okay, so now that we've got those in place, so all the bolts are the same size, they can just go in all of the other holes. I'm going to do this off camera. I've got all these bolts kind of finger tight here, and these bolts we're going to do in order 1, 2. I'll have to look at the order, but they get tightened down to 106 inch-pounds. Now, I don't have anything that goes that low. I do have this goes down to 120, so I've just kind of subtracted a little bit from it. It's a 10 millimeter. I think that'll be good enough. And we just tighten them down in order. 3, 4. I'm going to do that off camera because I don't think you want to watch me do that. So I'm looking at this, and if I put it down where I can see straight across, I can see that the intake seems to be lined up. I've tightened most of these down. But if I look at the exhaust, it looks still to be up a little bit. This might be off 1 tooth. So I'm going to loosen all of these up again. I'm going to move this down 1 tooth. I'm sorry about the lighting. It's kind of dark and I have to have my head light on. We have put this back in place. I turned this 1 more tooth and it looks much better. So we're going to go ahead and tighten these down, and they're 106 inch-pounds. which is just around 8 foot-pounds. So we're going to start on. These look to be right where I would expect them to be. So I'm going to go ahead and say that the timing is right on. What I'm going to do next is get the cap that goes right here put in place. So I'll get you set up and we'll do that. The last part of the timing pieces that we have to put in place, now that we've got everything lined up correctly, is this. And it's a timing cap that goes here. And these also should be tightened down to 106 inch-pounds. Okay, we've got everything in place. We can actually put the timing cover now on here that everything's in place, and we can start putting the other parts on the engine. Now that we have all of the timing done, I believe we can put this cap back on. So this cap just goes on here. It's a 16 millimeter, so that it has an O-ring on the inside right here. Make sure you have that on here, and it just kind of twists on. And this is not a torque fit part. You just kind of want to snug it down. It's just a cap. So now that we've got that on, we can continue with the rest. So now that we've got everything on, we've got both of the side covers on. Everything is almost sealed up on this engine oil-wise. So just to be sure that we don't get any more contaminants down in here, now that we've got everything timed correctly, we've got everything done here, let's go ahead and put this valve cover back on. And I'm going to flip it over. You can see it's got this rubber gasket. And this one's in really good shape. So I'm going to reutilize it. And it fits down into these spark plug valleys also. So I'm going to get you set up. We're going to put this on there. And it's held on by these bolts. I've got the valve cover here. And if you notice that on one side there are these kind of U-shaped parts of the gasket, and they go here. There's a couple of little valleys here, and there are some pins that sit in these holes here. So we're just going to gently set this on there and make sure the gasket is lined up correct. Kind of wiggle it in place if you have to. But you want to make sure that this gasket is not pinched around these U-shaped valleys or around the other side. And this looks fine. It doesn't have to sit in there all the way. We're going to put these bolts in, and these bolts have oil seals. So these oil seals sit in these holes where the bolts go. If these seals look like they're brittle, or if they look like they're torn, please replace them. You will have an oil leak. So we're just going to put these in, and these are 10 millimeter. I'm going to use this very gently. All of the oil parts of this engine are sealed up. There are some parts that I want to put on this engine before I put it in the bike. The first of those parts that I want to put on prior to that is right here, and that is this part. This is the cam chain tensioner. You can see it's got a offset set of holes, and it'll only go in here one way. But the first thing we need to do is retract this actual tensioner arm, and to do that we need to take out this 8 millimeter bolt at the top of it. I've taken this 8 millimeter bolt out of the end of here, and the reason for that is I know it's very hard to see down inside this part right here. But inside here, there is a flathead screw head And in the manuals, they want you to make some kind of tool, cut out some piece of metal, but I have a different way of doing this. I just take a small flathead screwdriver. I put it into that hole, seat it in that head, and then you just turn it clockwise. And as you turn it, you'll see that that part retracts. And then you kind of just hold it together with one hand if you can, like I am here. Because if you let that screwdriver loose, it's going to let this come all the way back out again. So now we've got to get this in here. We're going to set it in there and just kind of hold it. And there are two hex bolts here. These are 5mm hex bolts. So while I'm holding this in here, I've just got my 5mm on here. And I'm just going to go ahead and snug these down a little bit. They don't have to be perfect right now. And once you've got those snug down, you can let this kind of twist out. And you don't need to twist it, you know, just kind of let it go until it stops by itself. And then pull the screwdriver out. And I'll tighten these down a little bit more, just to be sure. And then we'll go ahead and put this screw back in. So, timing chain tensioner is installed. The next piece I want to put in is the starter. And this starter has only 2 bolts that hold it on. And this splined section goes in this hole and meshes with the starter gear inside here. First thing you want to do is check to make sure it still has this O-ring on it. If the O-ring is bad or nicked or looks like it's going to leak in any way, go ahead and replace it before you put this in. But it's very simple. This just slides into this hole. May have to wiggle it in there a little bit and then line it up with these 2 holes. So that is as simple as you can get. There's one key thing you don't want to forget, and that is this. This is the negative battery cable, so you can see both ends of it. This end of this negative battery cable goes directly under this mounting bolt on the starter to ground the starter and the rest of the bike to this engine case. Now these are the bolts. They're 10mm bolts. And I'm not sure what the torque is on these, but it's about that much. Okay, that's it. Starter installed, negative battery cable installed also.